Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our weekly webcast with our founder and president, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Today is January 8th, 2020, and you could say we've entered this new year with both a tremendous potential for positive developments, but also an ominous warning of the danger of nuclear war. This has to do with the assassination last week of Soleimani, the Iranian leader of the Al-Quds force. There's been a lot going on in the last couple of days around this. So we're going to start with an update from Helga on what's happening between the United States and Iran.
Well, we are in a very grave situation, which could very well be the period before World War III. I think this has been recognized by any reasonable force in the world, and only the warmongers are cheerful about the assassination of General Soleimani. I want to point your attention, you that being the audience and listeners, to a very important video which was done by my late husband already more than 20 years ago. It was called Storm Over Asia. And I want you to take the time to watch this video, because here he, in an amazing epistemological clarity, pointed to the great game of the British Empire against Russia and China. And what we actually see right now is really that scenario being played out. Now, there are many things to be said about it, and we will go into some of it. There are many stories floating around, interpretations and so forth. But let me start with a different point. There is a solution. It may sound difficult, but there is only one solution in my view, and that would be to have an emergency summit between President Trump, President Putin, and President Xi Jinping, to have a discussion and to lay out an intervention. Because I don't think that any lesser combination is sufficient to diffuse this extremely advanced picture. Now, for the moment, the Iranian response was relatively calm. They warned the Iraqi government 30 minutes before they did their limited counterattack against two Iraqi bases, which are the home of US and I think also NATO troops. So the soldiers could be evacuated, so no casualties occurred. Now, this brief moment gives actually the chance for de-escalation, because the Iranians did a counterstrike, so they can save face internally and say, that they did not let this assassination go unanswered. It could also give a chance for President Trump to de-escalate. As a matter of fact, he is giving a speech right now as we are talking, so we are not taking into account yet what he is saying. But Trump has said many times, even after the strike against Soleimani, that he does not war, that he does not want regime change. So we have to see. We don't know yet what he's going to say. But what I'm proposing is actually a solution, because obviously the situation is a big mess. The Iranian people are absolutely in an uproar. There is a very big anti-American sentiment right now. So anything coming from the US alone is probably not going to be sufficient. But if you had a summit between President Xi Jinping, Putin, and Trump to work out a plan, a comprehensive plan to give security guarantee to the Iranians, and that is necessary because the only reason why the Iranians wanted to have their nuclear weapons program is because they know Israel has about 200 to 300 nuclear warheads, and they do not feel that they are protected. So if there would be a security guarantee for Iran, this is an absolutely important ingredient. But then you also need to have the cooperation of these three most important world powers to put on the table a comprehensive peace plan for the entire Southwest Asia region, which could be done very easily because the new Silk Road policy of China is already working at different aspects of the region. You have investments in this direction in Iran, in Pakistan. The Chinese have committed themselves to help the reconstruction of Syria. Assad just said that the only way how you can reconstruct Syria is with the new Silk Road. And there was a plan already existing between the Iraqi prime minister and China for a memorandum of understanding for an oil for technology agreement, whereby Iraq would sell oil to China, and China in turn would build up the infrastructure, industry, and agriculture of Iraq. So elements of this are there. But in order to absolutely make sure that there is not another provocation and not another thing goes wrong, because it's the nature of big wars, and especially the world wars, that they never ever occur how people have planned it, but there is a big danger of miscalculation, of things going wrong. So you need at this point to use the shock that people realize that we are on the verge of World War III to really change the paradigm completely and have an emergency summit between these three presidents. And I actually appeal to you, our viewers and listeners, that you help in this mobilization. We have started an international mobilization with a statement I put out last Friday, immediately following the assassination of Soleimani, calling for exactly that. That call has been turned into a petition. This petition is being circulated widely in the United States and internationally. And I would ask you to go to the link underneath this webcast and download this, circulate it through your own networks, emails, Facebook, Twitter, social media, get it around in your friends and colleagues, because only if we have a cause internationally of people, forces demanding that such a summit takes place, that we can create the momentum to turn this situation around. So this is my immediate appeal to you. There should not be any discussion which does not demand this summit. I think this is an important international laser-like focus in order to turn the situation around.
Helga, I was interviewed on Radio Sputnik from Washington, D.C. today, and the hosts endorsed this idea, but they were very intrigued at your initiating it. And they wanted to know in particular what you thought Putin could do that couldn't be done by anyone else. And I told them I'd ask you that to get your response.
Well, I mean, I think first of all, Putin has proven to be a brilliant strategist. He already 5 months ago had pulled together the entire region. He had put pressure on the Saudis, on Israel, on Turkey. As a matter of fact, Putin is in Turkey today. He was there for the ceremony of opening Turk Stream, the pipeline. Then he also was in Damascus. He has obviously connections to all relevant governments, and they all have a vested interest to have good relationship with Russia. Now, I think that the Iranians, without the guarantees of Putin and Xi Jinping, they at this point would under no circumstances trust Trump or the United States alone. But if you had the combination of those three leaders, I think that they represent de facto, a representation of world leadership, and it does require that kind of intervention to reverse the danger of war. So I think anybody who thinks about it, can understand that, how do you diffuse a situation which is almost out of control, which has a tremendous potential of escalation, that only if you have the trust some countries and forces have in China, others in Russia, some in the United States. But, as you can see by the deadlock in the UN Security Council, if you don't break that you have always, the one side against the other side, you're not going to solve it. You need this emergency summit. And I think on the level of the presidents, there is the clear intention to solve it. Not necessarily on the entire level of the administration in Washington, which is highly divided, and we come to this in a second. But I think Trump has made very clear many times he wants to have a good relationship with Russia. He's, despite all difficulties, trying to improve the situation with China. And I think that the entire coup and everything which, from Russiagate, the impeachment, was designed to derail exactly that intention of President Trump. So I think that if you think it through, I think it's the only viable solution to address the problem.
You mentioned before the video your husband did, Storm Over Asia. Even before that, maybe 15, 20 years before that, I believe in the mid-1970s, he traveled to Iraq and made a proposal of oil for technology. So this new memo of understanding really is something that he laid out many, many years ago. And how do you think something like that could work?
Well, it's very simple. What my husband developed in 1975, following his trip to Iraq, was called the Oasis Plan. And it was the idea that, given the fact that the key ingredient which is lacking in the entire region, from actually the whole strip of desert from the coast, the Atlantic coast of Africa, through the Sahel zone, Sahara, through the Saudi Peninsula into the Middle East, then into China, all the way, up to northern China, you have this incredible strip of desert which is growing, and the entire region has no plants. I flew once over it and I looked out of the window, and it is amazing. You look for an oasis and there is none. So this proposal of my husband of 75 was the idea that you have to create a lot of new water through modern means. You can immediately tap into the aquifers, but that is limited. Then you need peaceful nuclear energy, small nuclear reactor to desalinate enormous amounts of water. As you can use for irrigation. You can also use modern technologies like ionization of the atmosphere, which is already used in some of the Gulf states and Israel. I think also you create plenty of new fresh water for irrigation, for agriculture, for reforestation, and then you can build infrastructure as a precondition for industrialization. And if you take the existing New Silk Road plan of China, the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been proposed by President Xi already in 2016 when he visited Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. He already proposed to extend the Belt and Road Initiative to the entire region. And in the meantime, you have the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. You have the promise of Assad and China to reconstruct Syria this way. You had several big conferences in the Gulf states where it is clear the Arab states have also an enormous interest. Also, Iran has good relations with China. So and Turkey, naturally, Turkey has expressed many times that they want to be an integral part. So if you just extend the Belt and Road Initiative into the entire region, it would be very easy. And I've said many years ago, like my husband, we have been working on this always together, that if you have the large neighbors of the region, Russia, China, India, Iran, Egypt, and then have Turkey, even Saudi Arabia, and even Israel, they would recognize that it is their benefit to work together for the prosperous development of the entire region. Now, if the United States would take a positive attitude towards that, investors could make so much more money in creating the biggest boom you can imagine, rather than thinking the control of the oil is the only thing which counts. Fossil fuels, oil, it's limited. It's not something one should use for energy anyway. And if you had a real economic investment program, many, many times larger than the Marshall Plan, a lot more profit could be made, and it would be an incentive for many entrepreneurs to be engaged. Also, the Europeans, Germany, Italy, France, all of these countries are being torn apart because of the refugee crisis. If you would start a joint development of all the major countries I just named, including India, which has a vested interest, for example, in Afghanistan, and also naturally the situation around Kashmir, Pakistan, which can only be solved if you have an integrated development plan. The refugee crisis could be solved very easily if you develop Southwest Asia and naturally Africa. So I think that such an intervention is necessary, and sometimes you need a shock. You need the shocking awareness that we are about to blow up the world if we don't change the paradigm. A shock which can be turned into a chance. And many people have mentioned that the Chinese character for crisis is the same like for opportunity. And I think if we had a chorus of people around the world now, people who are concerned about the danger of war, who are concerned about endless wars which need to be ended, well, then work with us, get together, and let's create an atmosphere where the popular demand for such a summit is so overwhelming that it will happen.
As you've been presenting the solution to the crisis, one of the things that comes up is that there were steps being taken by President Trump. His announcement several months ago of the withdrawal from Syria, everyone was predicting terrible consequences, but it worked, which was coordinated with Erdogan, with Putin, even with Assad. Then he went to Afghanistan and talked about withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. The people who were trying to impeach him went crazy. The war hawks in the House and the Senate and both parties opposed it. I think from that standpoint, we have to look at the question of how did this current event crisis get precipitated? What was the sequence of events that led to it? Because there are some very clear indications that the same people who were out to impeach Trump and oppose his peace program are the ones who are supporting the war with Iran. So can you go through a little bit of that sequence, Helga?
Yes, there is actually a very interesting article by Patrick Lawrence, who is a very interesting person. He was the first one to break the story by William Binney that there was no Russian hack already in 2017 in the American magazine or journal, The Nation. So he had an article 2 days ago in Consortium News, which I also would urge you, our viewership, to read, because don't rely on many dubious sources, but look at this article and form your own judgment, because what he says is a highly interesting hypothesis, because he says that there is actually circumstantial evidence that it was not Trump who ordered the coup. Now, I know that people are completely freaked out all over the place about what Trump said. Admittedly, some of these statements are inexcusable. I mean, you cannot say that the cultural heritage of a nation is being destroyed now. They try to backrow on that. That's fine, but Trump is just sometimes a little bit erratic, and I think everybody in the whole world knows that. But that doesn't mean that he orchestrated this assassination. What Patrick Lawrence proposes there, or he obviously is a well-connected source in the intelligence community. He says that it was a palace coup, that it was the same combination of people who already tried and effectively, repeatedly sabotaged Trump's policy on North Korea, on Syria, on the Gulf in general. Namely, he points to the axis between Pompeo, Esper, the defense secretary, and Milley. I think Milley would have been the person to present Trump with options of what to do. And, obviously the killing of the top military leader of another country, who happens to be also the number 2 of that country, setting in motion a sequence of events which, if there's not a serious intervention to calm it down, could potentially go completely out of control. Nobody in their right mind would give the president of the United States such an option, but there should have been an effort to absolutely say this is no option, but this was not done. Instead, Pompeo and Esper apparently told Trump that there was an imminent and sinister danger, an imminent attack against American installations and personnel, because when Trump then made this announcement, that's what he said. Now, if you look at the story, how it evolved, about 10 days prior to the assassination, there were several bomb attacks on military bases in Iraq belonging to the Kataib Hezbollah, which is not the same thing like the Lebanon Hezbollah, but it's a Iraqi paramilitary organization which was very involved in the fight against ISIS. So following these attacks, which were in turn of a shelling, which they were accused of having shelled another Iraqi base earlier, following these bombings were then the demonstrations in front of the US Embassy, which then were called off. But that was then the prelude for this attack on General Soleimani. Now, several people, including the Iraqi Prime Minister Mahdi, told the Iraqi parliament that Soleimani was on his way to Baghdad to meet himself, to meet Mahdi, and that he was on a diplomatic mission to negotiate between Saudi Arabia and Iran to try to get some kind of a rapprochement between the Sunnis and the Shiites. And this was actually ordered by the White House, by Trump himself. Now, Pompeo immediately came out yesterday and said, no, there was no such mission. But, Mahdi said it, that there was such a mission. And obviously, obviously whoever did this attack knew exactly where this drone had to hit, because, they knew that Soleimani would be there at this moment. And also the deputy leader of an important Iraqi military operation was also killed, and several other people. But as we have been hearing from some other military experts, these kinds of things don't happen just out of the blue. There is actually a target list for drone attacks, which has been worked out, in this case, by the US CENTCOM Department Orange. And that is, I think, sitting in South Carolina right now. And, basically, with other words, these are premeditated lists for such attacks. And, this should absolutely have never happened. And Trump was simply presented with a situation where he had to save face, because de facto everything had been put into place already. Now, Pompeo has not yet presented any evidence. And naturally, this is all still in the realm of hypothesis. I think that this needs a serious investigation. I think evidence has to be presented. But I think this is a very, very plausible hypothesis of how it happened. And the conclusion Patrick Lawrence makes, it is the same people who are involved in the impeachment. This is also coming now from a whole bunch of other Trump supporters, actually, and people who are not Trump supporters, who say, why should we listen to the same newspapers and the same forces, what people generally call the deep state, who are involved in the Russiagate, in the impeachment, and against Trump, and who are obviously now pushing this whole line. So why should we all of a sudden believe these people? So I'm urging you, look at the situation. It's more complicated than it meets the eye. And, you know, given the absolute outrage about Trump, which is happening as a result of this, I think a clinical view of this is all the more important.
I think one of the more compelling statements on this came from Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, the former chief of staff for Colin Powell, when Powell presented the false evidence about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. Wilkerson did a short statement where he said, indisputable evidence of this. Haven't we heard this before? Are we going to make the same mistake over and over again? And I think the importance of an investigation of this is crucial. But people who want to support the president, the best way to support the president is not to pretend this is a World Wrestling Federation match and you have to jump up and down and cheer everyone that gets hit. You have to start from the higher strategic standpoint. And I think, Helga, that's the importance of looking at something like Storm over Asia and the long-term view of who benefits from these kinds of wars. And you've been outspoken in your commitment to overcome the doctrine of geopolitics. Isn't that ultimately what we're dealing with and what the president has to come to terms with?
Yes, I think that the control of the British Empire, going way back to the Great Game, to the policies of Sykes-Picot, of the Bernard Lewis plan, of Samuel Huntington, of Brzezinski. I mean, all of these, was geopolitics as it was designed by Mackinder, the Haushofer Doctrine, the evil idea that, you have to prevent a cohesion in the Eurasian landmass because it's at the detriment of the Atlantic powers, namely the United States and Great Britain. And that doctrine that you have to manipulate, and when the British after World War I divided the region, Sykes-Picot, they did it deliberately. The Samuel Huntington ridiculous book about the clash of civilization, which I many years ago did read. I've tortured myself to read this. This guy had no knowledge about any of the cultures and religions he was talking about. But this is the handbook of manipulation. Now that has to stop. And the reason why I'm saying that we need the cooperation in this crisis now between Putin, Trump, Xi Jinping, and hopefully Modi comes along also in the same summit. And later on, it's not exclusive, but other countries are absolutely welcome to cooperate. But you need a core group, the US, Russia, and China as a minimum. Hopefully India joins in, but the three of them are the most important ones. If they would join hands and say, we understand that humanity has reached a point of potential no return, and therefore we overcome this and we develop a peace plan for the region, which has been tortured by 19 years of Afghanistan war, many millions of people who lost their life. Trump said, this cost the United States $7 trillion. It costs millions of people's lives, civilians, many thousands of Americans. It has to stop. And I'm absolutely 100% sure that if there would be created an international environment where you have a chorus of people, of countries, of peace groups, of religious groups, who already, there are several people now mobilized in petitions and so on. If all of them would say, we need a higher level of cooperation, it can be done. I think we need such a kind of a world mobilization to make it happen. And that's why I'm appealing to you. Join our efforts, subscribe to our newsletter, join, share the petition with all the people you know, and let's really get this mobilization because it is a very serious moment in history.
Let me just reiterate the main point. Once again, the solution is available, but it requires your activity. Go to our website. There's the emergency call from Helga Zepp-LaRouche. You can sign it, circulate it, submit it as op-eds and papers. Do everything you can to create the counterpole to the war drive that's coming from the same people who are out to impeach the president. So with that, we'll see you again next week.